To expose Lambda functions outside, you would generally use an AWS API Gateway. But then you would have to pay per request, and it can be quite expensive if you have a lot of traffic going through this API Gateway. So we have a way to expose these Lambda functions directly through our Gloo platform gateway and bypassing the AWS gateway or AWS API Gateway. If you use EKS, you don't really need to do what I'm going to do right now, which is deploying this Amazon pod identity webhook. But here I'm basically using kind clusters, so I need to add this component and cert manager and so on, so that I can allow some of my pods to talk to these Lambda functions. Basically, you will see, I'll explain which components need to be able to reach out to these Lambda functions and talk to the AWS API. So I am deploying these different components over here. For example, cert manager, and then this Amazon pod identity webhook. And now that I have done that, I can annotate the service account that is used by the Istio Ingress Gateway so that the gateway is going to be able to send requests to some Lambda functions. So we can go ahead and configure this. And in the next step, we'll go ahead and create something we call a cloud provider. So you can see here there will be the platform team that'll be normally responsible for creating a cloud provider in the management cluster and telling you which account ID that needs to be exposed to the application teams, which region, and if also they want to enable discovery, for example. So you can create what we call cloud resources manually so that you can define the functions that people are able to use. Or you can just enable discovery, which is essentially what we are doing at this moment. Now, if I enable discovery, then I need to allow this management server in the management cluster to also talk to the AWS API to get information about available functions in Lambda or Lambda functions. So I'm doing this here, and if I go ahead and wait for a few seconds, what we'll start to see is cloud resources being created on what has been discovered. So I can look at these and see that automatically we find out that there are a few functions that have been made available that have been discovered through the AWS API. So now, if I want to route some traffic over to one of these Lambda functions, it becomes very easy. And I can, just as a user, as an application owner, I can create a route table and say if there's traffic sent to this /lambda prefix, then I want to not send traffic to a pod in my cluster, but instead I want to forward this traffic to this Lambda function, which is called workshop echo. I don't want to do any transformation, so I just want to get the whole output from the Lambda function. So if I execute this command, and then if I run a curl on this path right here, I should get this output that is basically the standard output, or which is the raw output from this function. Then you can see the Lambda function itself so that it looks like it's returning what it's supposed to return. What's interesting is that you see here I have a JSON payload with the headers and the HTTP method and the path. Generally, what is happening is that you don't really want to return the raw payload. from the functions, because what is happening is you normally get this whole payload and the AWS API Gateway is using it to extract the header from the payload that needs to be returned to the end user on the body or of the body. So there is some transformation that is actually done by the AWS API Gateway. And if you want to replace the AWS API Gateway, then you need to make sure the same transformations are done by the Gloo Platform Gateway. So what we need to do in that case, and what we're going to show in the second example, is we are going to use a node.js Lambda function that returns this response with the status code, these headers, and some data in the body in the format that is expected by the AWS API Gateway. Then we're going to update our route table to send the traffic to this function. But if you observe here, we want to have the default response transformation, which means we want to transform the response in the same manner that the AWS API Gateway is doing it. So now, if I send my request here, I can see that I just get this body instead of getting the raw response. You can also see, if you look at the curl with the -i, this output is actually showing the headers. I can also see this key equals value, and this X custom header with my value actually comes from this Node.js function that has returned this different data in this JSON payload. So we've extracted this data from this payload and effectively transformed it in the same way that the AWS API Gateway would transform it. You can even apply some extra transformation and so forth, but the key idea here is to show you that you can easily replace the AWS API Gateway by using our gateway without having to change anything for the end user.